Appreciate it. Thanks to Alex and ICBC. This is going to be an exciting and exceptional panel. We've got a bunch of really talented, smart folks coming onto the stage right now. Immediately to my right is Emma Andrews. She is the Chief Commercial Officer of Bevcanna Enterprises, Inc. Just to her right is Bert Hick. He is the President of Rising Tide Consultants. Next on the line there is Niel Marotta. He's the President and CEO, Director and Founder of Indiva, one of the sponsors of the boat cruise tonight, so thanks very much. And to his right is Brandon Wright. Mr. Wright is the CEO of Dynaleo, a new entrant in the edible space. So very excited to have everybody here today, and thank you all for coming to ICBC and attending this wonderful conference. So, my name is Kirk. I used to be a lawyer in the cannabis space. I had the good fortune of representing Owen Smith in a case that arose out of a bust. He was baking cookies for the Vancouver Cannabis Buyers Club of Canada, one of the first compassion clubs in Canada. And he unfortunately ran into problems with the authorities. Because at the time, not only were compassion clubs illegal, but the medical cannabis system did not allow for anyone to consume cannabis in any way other than dried flowers, essentially. Couldn't have derivative products. A panel like this one would have been, sort of a distant dream back then in 2012. And so we took a challenge on behalf of the club and Owen all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. We won at the trial court level, we won at the Court of Appeal level, and I'm pleased that we won unanimously in the Supreme Court of Canada, and the restrictions to dried cannabis only were stricken. And I think that but for Owen's work and the witnesses in that case, none of us would be up here today. And so I salute him. And I note that the club continues to operate outside of the regulatory scheme. It's trying to do its best for its patients. We heard a lot earlier about the possibilities of challenges, constitutional challenges to come for Mr. Conroy and bringing access to the full spectrum of derivative products to medical cannabis consumers, and that work continues, and it's important and vital work, and I think we need to pay homage to it. So we're here to talk about changes that are coming in just a few short days, really. There's a new regulatory environment coming for derivative cannabis products. We're not talking about new products, but we are talking about new rules. And many have suggested that perhaps there are too many rules, or those rules are too restrictive. That was alluded to in the prior panel, and the possibility of a constitutional challenge. And so we're going to try to divide this panel into 3 topics and get through those topics in a manner that allows us to answer some questions towards the end. If we don't do that, grab any one of us out in the hallway. We're all happy to chat later and throughout the day. So we're going to talk about safety and compliance. We're going to talk about the rollout that's coming over the next few months of these new products and educating consumers and regulators. And then we're going to talk about the challenges and opportunities that are posed for branding and marketing for companies in this space. So let's start with safety and compliance and the rule set, so we understand, what are the rules of the road? What are the rules of the game? We heard earlier that there is some would say, fairly low limit on the amount of THC or CBD that can be in packaged good, edible products. And there's also some marketing restrictions that are in place and child safety restrictions that are in place. And we'll start off at the far end with Brandon. Give us sort of an overview of what are the rule sets, what are the biggest challenges posed as industry moves into this space.
Yeah, thanks, Kirk. So I think last panel we heard everyone talking about the 10 milligram THC limit, and obviously that's going to be a big one. It's not going to solve the problem for medical consumers up front, and we're going to have to work hard to push back against that and see what we can do to make it available for medical consumers. But the one piece of the rules that I do really like is so far they've proposed an unlimited limit on CBD content. We know that CBD is the next big thing coming up. We know that it has tremendous medical efficacy in many areas. And the ability for unlimited product formats in that category is really what excites us a lot. It allows for just so much more dynamic products and so much more availability. As well, we've seen recent regulations or proposed regulations released in the CHP product, which is going to be a combination of CBD and natural health product. Of course, it's still going to contain cannabis, so it's still going to have to be distributed through the provinces and through the normal cannabis channels. But again, opening up a lot more product categories and a lot more options.
This field, as we heard in the last panel, is regulated at multiple levels of government. And so, Bert, I'll ask you, because you do have experience in provincial regulatory policy, how are the various provincial governments going to help ensure that edibles, for example, are of sufficient quality and have accurate measurements of THC and CBD, and are also free of chemicals and possible contaminants such as pesticides from the plants that are grown to make these value-added products?
That's a good question. I'm a bit of a misfit on this panel because I come from 30 years of government regulation and first of all running the cabinet secretariat for Premier Bill Bennett, and then I was general manager of the liquor control licensing branch for several years, and the last 30 years consulting in liquor licensing. When the rollout of cannabis came about, we got involved with it mainly because we felt that we saw what was going to happen. It was going to be the same regulators that regulated liquor are going to be regulating cannabis now. Same process, same approach. And from my perspective on this topic is a lot of work still needs to be done. During the last several years, I've gone to a lot of cannabis conferences, and there aren't a lot of people here at these conferences from government. I don't know if there's anybody here from the liquor branch or liquor cannabis branch, or if there's anyone here from the cannabis distribution branch.
Or if they're willing to show it.
What's that?
Or if they're willing to show it.
Yeah, and we find that there's a lack of dialogue between the people in the industry and you folks who have been in the industry for the last umpteen years are to cannabis what NASA is to space. You know what's going on, and what we find is there's a lack of a dialogue. You have government making rules, and when I was in government, we used to have this saying, which was, don't start vast plans with half-vast ideas. And we often find that sometimes things are rolled out in government, and they didn't consider all the consequences, or what we would call the unintended consequences. That's what I'm concerned about here. There needs to be more dialogue. I'm glad to see that the industry is starting to get motivated and organized. Andrew was on the previous panel. He's working hard to create ACRES, Association of Cannabis Retailers, to lobby the government, but that's the way it's going to have to go. Now, with respect to the issue of quality, it's a huge issue now. We had one client who went to the government cannabis store here and bought 8 products. He took them to an independent lab to have them tested. One product came back positive for pesticides. Only one product was accurate in terms of what it was labeled. All the other remaining 6 had the wrong THC levels. So when you bring into the world of edibles, that's going to be a huge factor. And the other problem we have right now on the liquor side is filling the pipeline with product. And you might have heard that the BC government appointed an independent review of the distribution system for liquor because the private liquor store industry and restaurants have been complaining that they're getting cross-stock shortages. The product they order, like a new Scotch release or something like that, or a wine release, they don't get it, or they only get half of it. And I can see that happening with edibles, filling the demand. And I think the uptake for edibles is going to be huge, particularly with older people. And can they provide the product safely, quickly, with a shelf life to the retailers that is accurate in terms of its chemical composition or its quality, and that to me is huge. And I would like to see more dialogue with industry on this point.
So actually, Kirk, I want to jump in on 2 points there. First, there was a recent study done on about 1,500 people that showed of the 4 million cannabis users in Canada, the new regulations and edibles and vapes and so forth would add an additional 3 million users. So we are definitely going to see a new crowd jumping in. The second point I wanted to add was on the topic of quality control and industry associations. More recently, there was a conference that was called the C45 conference that was specific to upholding the standards of production of various things, and edibles was a big topic at that. The idea behind it is an industry association that advocates for high-quality products, advocates for production standards, and that we specifically recommended that they advocate for lab testing standards that are standard across Canada. I've been lab testing edibles now for almost 4 years, and it's obvious that not everybody does it the same, and that's a huge problem in the industry for consistency. If we're not getting the same testing done on one end of the country that we are at the other, we're going to have a problem here.
So the products that are coming online aren't new products, right? I mean, people make gummies, people make edible products, people make cookies. What's new, at least in the regulated framework, is that they now are going to have THC, CBD, and other cannabinoids in them. And so, Niel, I think let's come to you, and I'll ask you, these consumer packaged goods, these kinds of things that are already being sold, is there utility in having that kind of deep CPG experience come from other realms and come into the cannabis industry and help build that sort of safe, trusted, reliable model?
Sure. Yeah, we certainly think so. That's been a big part of our strategy. And let's say, looking at senior management, how we've added to the team aggressively in the last 12 to 18 months, as we've built out partnerships in the edible space like Bang and like Ruby Sugar. So we've drawn on, we're in London, Ontario, which is a terrific market with a rich history, not only agriculture, but also food manufacturing and processing, as well as manufacturing of all kinds of other products. So there's a terrific labor force. London's not a huge city, but there's over 500,000 people, and I would say a disproportionate amount of skilled labor relative to the size of the city. So absolutely, we're adding in that area intentionally. Our VP of Operations has 25 years of experience working with companies like Clorox and General Mills, Maple Leaf Foods, B&G. Our Director of Ops was at Nestle for well over a decade, and we continue to draw people from other CPG companies like Pepsi, et cetera. So that's a huge part of addressing, I think, what Bert just brought up, which is how do you create a consistent quality product that lives within the regs and doesn't test negative for pesticides, et cetera. It's hugely important.
Circling back on safety and this 10 milligram maximum THC per package that's being implemented by Health Canada, Emma, what do you think that cap on the potency of your products has in terms of defining who the consumers are that will eventually purchase those products at the point of retail? Is it a different thing entirely than, for example, a medical consumer base? And how are other jurisdictions regulating in this area? We heard from Lori Ajax earlier about California. What are we doing vis-a-vis a market that's about the same size as Canada, 35 million or so people, that's coming online at about the same time as Canada? How do we stack up?
This is really a new consumer category, and I think anyone who is an avid consumer in the audience would testify to this, that a 10 milligram limit may not be enough if you are a high tolerance consumer. So in terms of your customer segmentation, I think for these infused products, you really are targeting the canna curious, the novice consumer. Means there's a lot of due diligence in terms of pairing education with your product concepts as well, and really advocating for safe and responsible consumption if this is going to be someone's first experience. I think also by nature of the product format, it's non-combustible, it's not smokable, so it's very approachable to a wider segment of consumers. So when we compare this to looking down at the US marketplace in California specifically, there's 100 milligram potency for a beverage as an example, as the upper limit. So the consumer that's drawn towards that product is perhaps from the legacy market or a higher tolerance consumer. They're what's currently going into the dispensaries demanding these products, and so the dispensaries in California haven't been as open to carrying a wide selection of the lower potency drinks because they're thinking the consumer's not there yet. But those products at that type of potency are really to draw in the new consumer. So it's the brand's responsibility to make sure they're building awareness outside of retail to drive that consumer in store, to know that there's a product format and a potency that's appropriate for them. So I think for Bevcanna, that's really been the focus, is looking at the new consumer, what are their aptitudes and motivations, and pairing products that are 10 milligrams and less, so starting at potentially a microdose, 2.5 milligrams, in different ranges. And I think too, as a manufacturer, that's obviously an advantage to get people to consume more of your product. So if you're creating too high of a potency, it doesn't really leave a lot of room for multiple consumption occasions, potentially within a day or potentially within any given purchase. So definitely think this is a new consumer category with that type of potency limit.
To me, the 10 milligram limit is like light beer. Blech. It's going to me, ensure the continuation of what I call the $100 on the barbecue. I have a friend, she's got Crohn's disease, and every Friday, she and her husband place $100 in an envelope and put it on the barbecue. They come home that night, the $100 is gone, and there's a little bag there because it helps her with her Crohn's disease. The 10 milligram is not enough. All this is going to do is make a lot of fat people, and it's going to hurt the consumer because imagine how many brownies you're going to have to get the right THC level. I think it's something I have to revisit. It reminded me also years ago the BC government brought in a minimum drink price for alcohol. And they got protests from the legions and veterans clubs because they set the drink price too high. They didn't consult. So they had to go back and lower it to get it so that when you went into a legion, it was cheaper. I think this is one they have to go back and rethink.
Yeah, I'd love to add a little anecdote to that as well. So for the past, when we first entered the market about 4 years ago, for anyone who doesn't know my background, my last company was called Baked Edibles, recently purchased by Pasha Brands. Thank you very much. You guys are fantastic. But when we first entered the market, it was all high-dose stuff, all of it. And everyone who was in the market was an educated consumer. They knew exactly what they were looking for. They often knew what potency they were looking for. And the majority of the products that we sold over 50 SKUs, were on the higher end of the range. At some point after about a year and a half, we started introducing low-dose products because there were new consumers entering the market who wanted these products. Ultimately, in the first year, it looked like this, one giant hump of high-dose products. And this, we're talking like 200 and 400 milligram brownies as our number one selling product. Soon, after about a year and a half, and ultimately over the course of the next 3 years, as we added these lower dose products, like a 5 milligram gummy, I kid you not, it is literally the opposite end of the spectrum. That's where the other giant hump of consumers started coming in. The middle areas were so-so, but without a doubt, the potency at the high end was huge, and there's a huge segment of customers who are going to be left behind, who are going to remain in the legacy market as long as they can, because that's where they'll find the products until we see a solution that's appropriate to transitioning them into the legal market.
I think, can I just add one thing? I think I preface everything I'm about to say by, I think it makes sense to have two tracks, one for medical and one for rec, where a medical patient can order a higher dose product. I've had family members that were dosing with RSO, fighting cancer. We're taking hundreds of milligrams a day. So that's a totally different sport. It's not the same conversation. And I agree completely with Brandon. There is this barbell, we've got the really high dose, let's say folks that have built up a big tolerance and, 10 or 20 milligrams, which by the way is still the cheapest date in town for a novice. I mean, if you spend $10 and buy, let's say 2 chocolates and you've got a total of 20 milligrams, that's a lot for someone that's new to trying edibles. And I think what we don't want is to create really bad experiences for new users. You're going to get a lot of pushback, and it's going to go right up to the government really quickly. So we've tried to at least embrace. I mean, you'll beat your head in complaining about government rules. The other thing I would say is we're still very thankful that we're the first G7 country to have legalized recreationally. And this is still version 1.0. I mean, there's room, let's say, in time to change and allow for higher doses.
And I think they did underscore in the last panel, and I noted as well in Ms. Ajax's discussion earlier that California has chosen to have separate tracks for medical and non-medical consumers, adult use consumers versus medical consumers. And it seems to me that our federal government here is in some respects abdicated their responsibility to medical consumers in this legalization 2.0 that are rolling out derivative products. And it's somewhat personal to me because I spent a lot of time litigating this issue and the brave people that came and testified in the Smith case and Mr. Smith himself. We did a lot of work to ensure that patients had access to derivative products, period. And it feels like some of that is being undone with these potency limits, even though myself as a 35-year cannabis consumer, I'm not taking a 400 milligram brownie. There's just no chance that that's ever occurring. I'm the low dose consumer, despite the fact that I have high tolerance when I'm smoking cannabis.
And Kirk, don't get me wrong.
Different strokes for different smoke.
I agree with the 10 milligrams as a dose. I don't necessarily agree with it being limited to one package. It's a hugely undue burden on industry, undue on consumers, on the environment.
Yeah, I think we're all on the same page there. So we do have the rules, though. They have been written. There was opportunity for public comment. Comments were given. some were heated, some were not heated. That particular one, I think, was the decision was made to go conservative early versus more liberal early. But now we have a rollout. We're mid-September here. October 17 is Legalization 2.0 in terms of these products being theoretically able to come online. And I know it may not feel like things are happening quickly to people that have been in the industry, living and breathing this, but when I talk to bureaucrats, they think things are moving at the speed of light. So this is a real difference between people that are living and breathing cannabis in the industry side and people that write rules and change legislation for a living. Industry's got to be nimble. Let's talk a little bit about this rollout that's coming in the next 90 days from both the industry and consumer perspectives. Emma, there's this thing that people talk about in industry. It's the first to market idea. It's like you get there first, you have an opportunity to potentially gain early market share and dominate the category. How does the regulatory scheme that's in place currently pose challenges to processors and manufacturers like Bevcanna looking to get that early mover advantage?
I think if anyone's aware, there's a regulation that exists that the facility must be fully built and established before you are in ability to receive your license. So this really positions people that have existing manufacturing expertise ahead of the curve. The ability to scale up to commercialization and optimize your production practices to accommodate things like child-proof lids, to accommodate applying the excise stamp, to accommodate labeling lot code and potency per batch along your production line. These aren't easy learning curves to go through if you haven't worked on an existing bottling plant or an existing manufacturing line before. So while that is a hindrance maybe to new market entrants, it's an advantage to those that have an existing expertise within manufacturing. So you'll see a lot of early market entrants that have that expertise in the background, whether that's Constellation Brands, whether that's the Molson Coors Hexo collaboration, or whether that's up-and-comers like Bevcanna that are making use of an existing manufacturing facility based in Osoyoos, actually. But I think there's a big learning curve to go through, and so that's been causing some headaches, obviously, as we work through implementing things like the child-proof lids, the per package stipulations, but then also getting your facility modified in order to meet the security requirements for your processing license. So that early mover advantage, I think, is only an advantage if you have an existing asset or infrastructure that you're taking advantage of. And as many of us probably know, it won't be December until the beginning products start to appear in market. But I think this is really a 2020 rollout. So that early mover advantage could actually be Q4 of 2020. So there's still a wide open market to seize here.
So let's tease that out a little bit. It seems to me that when we saw the transition from in the cultivation side, for example, we saw a lot of existing greenhouses convert from green pepper production, for example, to cannabis production, which gets you a little bit of an advantage versus building a purpose-built facility that takes a substantial amount of time to complete. It seems to me that if you've got a food manufacturing plant and you're making brownies already and they're moderately successful, maybe you just bring in the THC and CBD and run a couple extra shifts and infuse your already existing products in your already existing plant. Brandon, is that a feasible path to market?
I'd say it's a lot more difficult in this industry than it is in the traditional food manufacturing. For those of you who can probably imagine what the life of an entrepreneur would look like in traditional food manufacturing, you probably start with a farm stand, a couple of good products out of your home kitchen, you sell locally, you scale up, you scale up, you scale up, and suddenly you get there. In this industry, good luck. You can't sell any of that. You have to have $1 million and get an LP. What that means is it's shutting out a tremendous number of small players who would be producing these otherwise incredible products and who could be coming into this market. And what it's doing is leaving folks like us with the burden of taking on all those products. So I think we're going to see a real dramatically slow inclusion of different products as it comes along. There's a lot of companies who've really hesitated to take that risk into edibles right off the start. A lot of companies are starting with 1 or 2 products, but without a doubt, selection and product quality and everything else, it'll improve slowly over time as opposed to what it would have done had we been able to shape this in the way that small entrepreneurs and small were better facilitated into coming in.
Those small entrepreneurs, too, I think, are forced into a different type of business equation because they have to license or give up a little bit of their intellectual property and their equity in that idea to somebody who would take their product to market under their own license. So, yeah, it creates a lot of stifling, I think, for those entrepreneurs that have the hustle and heart that deserve a go at this. There's no commissary kitchen model right now for
frustrating.
these products. Yeah.
And the reality is that Health Canada made a decision to not allow co-location with food production. So if you have an existing food production facility, you think, well, I can run my food production and then I can bring in another shift and I can just infuse these products with cannabis. You simply can't do that.
You can't with the cannabis ingredients. So as an example, the packaging or the bottles that Bevcanna uses are made on a different side of the operation, completely divided in separated buildings, but we can blow plastic on one side of the operation. Essentially, it's a transaction sold into the other side of the operation. So there are some ways to create efficiencies, but certainly not within any of your ingredients or the production line itself. So it literally is duplicating all of your production capabilities.
Yeah, I was sitting in a meeting with the BC Food Processors Association about a year ago at this point when the regs were first announced, and they've been holding meetings over the course of the last 2 or 3 years and kind of bringing in people from food and starting to think, hey guys, start thinking about the edibles, it's going to happen. And in a room full of 60 people, most of whom were involved in the food industry alone, I think it was maybe me and Cannabis from the cannabis side, and they announced the regulations, and the despair in that room was just palpable. It was crazy seeing how every single company there was thinking, great, we get to use this excess capacity that we've already built out on our cookie line, on our brownie line, on our snack bar line, and then suddenly dreams were shattered and they realized it was an entirely new business that they would have to build and partner with someone who was experienced from the industry. The burden became imaginably high.
So there are sort of rollout issues on the industry side, but there's a positive coming too. It was Brandon referenced earlier that there's some data suggesting that there's up to 3 million new consumers that are waiting to enter this space and become cannabis consumers, but that stay away from consuming cannabis currently because they don't want to smoke or vape. Niel, what do you think this suggests, both in terms of the need for education of those new consumers, but also the cultural shifts that's happening when millions of new people begin to consume cannabinoids?
Right. Well, education is hugely important. So we're very proactive about publishing things on our website and through social media, giving people advice about, I don't know what start low and go slow means. We've sort of started saying try some and then wait till tomorrow. There's no reason for anyone to have a bad experience unless they have no coaching on how to go about trying an edible. And that just relates, I think, primarily to milligrams and what you're dosing, partly what you're eating as well. A chocolate might kick in a little differently. Given the cocoa butter is a great conduit versus, let's say, a gel cap or another product. So education goes a long way. But what we've tried to do also in the spirit of that education is not just bring a marriage of, say, chocolate and distillate, that's nice, but we partnered with Bang intentionally through our joint venture in Canada, where we have the exclusive right to produce and sell those products across the country and export from Canada, because that's a cannabis brand. And so there's brand value there, important brand value, and trust. But also, this is not a science experiment. These products already exist in the market in California. They've moved into Nevada now and Florida. So to us, that's the essence of global branding, where someone can go buy a Bang chocolate, let's say at the Honey Pot in Toronto, or at one of the dispensaries in Vancouver, and it will be the same chocolate and the same recipe if you went to MedMen in Venice Beach or something, let's say, or in San Diego or San Francisco. You'll find the same products. Might be a little different dosing, will absolutely be different packaging. There'll be French on it in Canada, for starters, but that's, to us, that is hugely important. The same thing with Ruby. The cannabis sugar and salts that they make are sold in Washington State now. It's a much younger company than Bang, but interesting, disruptive product that are cannabis brands and cannabis products to begin with.
I think one of the most important pieces of education, too, is actually the feedback loop for the consumer. So products that are made with water-soluble technology means that there's a quicker onset, so the consumer's better able to regulate their experience, dose, and outcomes based on that quicker feedback loop than something that's a fat-based edible. That might be a homemade brownie where, we've all had those experiences in the past where it's so variable, depending on your own endocannabinoid system, depending on the dose that you ate, depending on what part of the brownie tray it was from. So this homogeneity that's required as part of our regulations requires a technology advantage like a water-soluble extract. So that gives you that quicker feedback loop. So the consumer has more instantaneous awareness about what their experience is about to be and will be over the subsequent few hours. So you may not have to wait till the next morning, right? You might have that feedback or should have that feedback within, let's say, less than 15 minutes is kind of the common standard with water-soluble extracts.
So Bert, there's this pent-up demand we're hearing about for these different varieties of products, and Legalization 2.0 is scheduled to come online October 17. And these products will be legal, technically, for commercial sale at that point. Of course, you can make them at home currently now if you want to, but they'll be legal for sale on October 17. Does that mean we have products on the shelves on October 18? Or is there some obstacles in the way to actually seeing products? And if so, when do you expect that to actually roll out and you can go to your store and buy a cannabis-infused chocolate?
I think it'll go the same way as the retail cannabis stores have gone. It'll be a slow rollout, adding it on. When we got into licensing retail stores, we were surprised how long the application process takes. We did last fall, about a year ago now, we did an application for one of our liquor clients for a liquor store, a pub up on Main Street. And this is an experienced licensee, and his application was about 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch thick for a liquor primary license. During the same time, this gentleman decided to get into the world of cannabis. So we put in a cannabis retail store application, and it was 15 inches high. Same person, same business, but it's 15 inches. That application took a long time to get through the process, and we've had people that we were working with about a year ago who are still waiting. Now, some of it is the fault of the applicants, but it's a very slow process going through the government. What we're finding is that there are not enough stores out there now to even serve the demand for cannabis now. A lot of people between the provincial regulations and the municipalities are really delayed. I think with the coming out of edibles, I think it'll be a slow process to get them into the stores. And again, what the process right now is going to do is give a huge advantage to the BC government cannabis stores or the government cannabis stores over the private stores. And I also, comes back to my supply issue, the second thing I think it'll do is prop up the black market even further. It's such a disincentive to the consumer because most people that we talk to are really anxious to get into edibles. They don't want to vape, they don't want to smoke, but they would consume an edible. I think there's going to be huge demand for it, but I don't think the pipeline's going to be full right at the beginning. But yet I think it's fascinating. I look at what's going on in edibles, similar to what happened in craft beer and now refreshment beverages in the liquor stores. We've got a plethora of refreshment beverages in the liquor stores, Mike's Hard Lemonade came along, and then after that, there's an explosion of refreshment beverages. I think the same thing will happen with edibles. I think there'll be a really innovative, creative stuff.
That innovation and that creativity hopefully will translate into a wide variety of products that consumers appreciate and can come back to. But you did mention, Bert, that there's this sort of elephant in the room, which is the fact that these products aren't really new. They're all for sale currently in Canada right now in the legacy marketplace. It's not easy to market your products. It's not easy to brand your products when you do it legally. You've got sort of big stop signs and small brand elements. You go into your local liquor store, and the craft beer industry has a wide variety of really interesting packaging options available to them. Some that might even be attractive to children. Placed right at child level on the stores, on the shelves in the store. So Emma, with those tight restrictions on branding and marketing, what opportunities are there for brands to carve out consumer awareness so that people come and say, well, actually that product's available at the legal dispensary?
So I've been working in product development for over a decade now in the natural products industry prior to working in cannabis, and I'm trained as a nutritionist as well, so this might be a little bit of a bias, but I think with as much restriction as there is on packaging, when a consumer approaches the shelf, there's very limited touch points for them to make their product decision based off of. So one of the things I think is really going to shine, especially in the onset of this category, perhaps before regulations change, is how clean are your ingredients? So if a consumer is able to, be appealed by maybe the color of the package or the method of consumption itself, they're interested in beverages, to pick up that package, what they're basing their decision off of is potency, for sure, price, of course, but then what's in that product. So is there artificial colors? Is there artificial sweeteners? Is there sweeteners in general? So for Bevcanna, we've been really looking at a clean ingredient label, minimal ingredients, no added sugars, no artificial colors, so nothing that would cause for concern, alarm, everything that's all natural. So I think that's a huge opportunity for brands and manufacturers, is to formulate with a higher quality standard so that there's nothing offensive making somebody put that product back on shelf. And then ultimately, I think efficacy is a big part of the marketing play. If your product delivers on the occasion that you're seeking, so something that's a little bit euphoric as an example, or something that helps you relax and unwind at the end of the day, these occasion-based types of outcomes, I think that's a big appeal in terms of somebody repeat purchasing or recommending that product or referring that product to others in their network. So in some cases, this comes back to grassroots marketing initiatives, word of mouth, and in other cases, it comes back to the fundamentals of product development, which is what are your ingredients and what's your quality standard when you're formulating. I think that's the huge opportunity here, especially at the beginning of this category.
I think another big key of consumer repetition on branding is just that repetition. With so few touch points, the store is the place where they see your brand first. If you're not on the shelf, they will replace you with the product next to you. So I think in the early rollouts, we saw a lot of companies who brought products to market early. They had that first mover advantage, but they couldn't hold it because their products didn't remain on the shelf. So I know we're producing a high volume strategy of always trying to be there no matter which brand we're producing for. And I think it's really important that the consumer can go in, see your product, and buy it over and over and over and over if it's the only place they're ever going to see your product.
I'm excited about Outdoor Grow coming online because I think that will help keep these products in supply, because the input amount that you're using is so minimal if you're using, refinement and purification in your extraction process. But hopefully we won't see the same supply issues as these categories come online. But I think that's a great point, is the replicatability of seeing these brands and the visibility in the market.
Strongly agree with the green labeling as well. We're going with natural fruit purees from Okanagan peaches and so forth.
Yeah. So we've got just about 2 or 3 minutes left. I did want to save a little bit of time for questions. Let's go to some questions. I'd ask that you just ask the question, ask it as succinctly as possible, and then in the answers, let's try to also be as succinct as possible, get through as many as we can in the next 2 minutes.
Thank you. Those are nice words. Let's hear it for the panel one more time. Brevity is the soul of wit. We'll go here, then we'll go there, and that'll be it.
Yeah, thanks. It was really interesting. So at the very beginning of the panel, you hit on quality and testing of these products. And to me, this is a really interesting issue. And I thought it was really interesting that you can test stuff that's on the shelf and get very different answers as to what's in there. So what do you think the solution to that problem is? Are we going to go to some standardized or validated testing process for this?
I can jump in on there, and yeah, I think you have something to add as well too. There is a variance that's actually allowed on the label. So depending on the potency that you're claiming, there's a different variance at different breaks along that potency spectrum. So what this means is a manufacturer could produce the label in advance just for efficacy and efficiency in their costing strategy. As long as their label is testing within that variance spec, they can release it into the market. But I think the due diligence is for the manufacturer to label based on the batch. So when you get your testing data back, to label it not just according to the variance that's allowed, but the actual values that were achieved for that batch. And that transparency ultimately, I think, is going to shine through in the eyes of the consumer, even if the retailer then has to do a little bit of explaining, why is this batch a little bit different than the last batch? But I think that's the ultimate implication for manufacturers and processors, is to label on a per batch basis to overcome that variance.
Yeah, there's very little times when the customer gets over the feeling of dishonesty. And especially when you're paying who knows how many dollars per 10 milligrams, every milligram that's not in there is hitting someone's wallet. But the other answer there, of course, is industry associations and coming from within industry to standardize testing across the provinces. There's no push for it from government right now because they've already handed out these testing licenses to the labs, and they assume that the labs are doing it at a high quality level. And they may well be. The difference is that they're not doing it standardized with standardized processes across the level. We knew a lab that was taking an entire brownie, breaking off a corner of it, blending that, and getting a result. That's not a homogeneous sample. It's not a representative sample. And so we're hoping that not all labs in Canada are doing that, but at the same time, we need everyone to be on the same page.
I want to say something. I think that we in the industry, and we come from all sides, makers, investors, entrepreneurs, I think we have a responsibility to find an international agency to develop testing standards. I'm in many countries in my investments, and I'm working on laboratories in some of the European ones, and we don't have high enough testing standards. And I think if we were the ones to propose them and maybe go to the United Nations to have them help us with these standards that could be accepted internationally, I think we'd put ourselves in a much better place. So that's my thinking.
I actually disagree with the we don't have high enough standards. I just don't think that they're consistent enough. I think in Canada we have the highest standards in the world for testing, especially on food products. But it's a very good point.
I think that I think that's
Agreed. We need to lead in this category globally.
it certainly speaks to the need for coming together and ushering in legalization 3.0, which hopefully will see the fall of the international drug control treaties and more coordinated effort across jurisdictions. So thank you all for your attention. Thanks to ICBC for having us, and over to you, Ngai.
Thank you, Kirk. Let's hear it for Kirk and all the fabulous panelists. That was great. Very informative.